For generations, the sacred fire had never died until the keeper revealed her secret to the wrong person, and the consequences would test the very soul of the Navajo nation. In the high mesa country of the Navajo lands, where red rocks pierced the sky like ancient fingers reaching toward the stars, there stood a sacred fire that had burned continuously for over 300 years. This was no ordinary flame, but the very heart of spiritual power for dying people, tended by an unbroken line of fire keepers who guarded its secrets with their lives. The current keeper was a woman named Aiisha, whose name meant she who keeps the light alive. At 45 winters, she had already served as the sacred fire's guardian for 27 years, having inherited the responsibility from her grandmother when she was barely 18. Aiisha lived alone in a traditional hogan built specifically for the firekeeper, positioned on a high plateau where the sacred flame could be seen from villages scattered across the vast Navajo territory. Day and night, in scorching summer heat and bitter winter cold, through sandstorms and flash floods, she maintained the ancient fire that connected her people to the spirit world. But Aiisha carried a burden that no firekeeper before her had ever borne. She carried a secret so dangerous that knowledge of it could destroy not just the sacred fire, but the spiritual foundation of the entire Navajo nation. The secret was this: the sacred fire was dying, not in the way that ordinary fires die, simply requiring more fuel to keep burning. No, this fire was dying from within, its spiritual essence slowly fading like the life force ebbing from an ancient tree. Each day, the flame grew slightly dimmer. Each night, it required more of Aisha's own spiritual energy to maintain its connection to the holy realm. Aiisha had first noticed a change 3 years ago, when the flame began to flicker during the most sacred ceremonies. At first, she thought it was her imagination, or perhaps a sign that she needed to purify herself more thoroughly. But as months passed, the signs became undeniable. The fire no longer provided the same spiritual warmth that had blessed countless generations of Navajo ceremonies. The visions that medicine men received when they gazed into its depths grew cloudy and uncertain. Most troubling of all, the fire's light, which had always been visible from dozens of miles away, was growing fainter each season. Aiisha had spent sleepless nights trying to understand what was happening. She had followed every ritual, observed every taboo, and maintained every tradition exactly as her grandmother had taught her. Yet somehow, the sacred connection was weakening. The answer, when it finally came to her, was more terrifying than anything she could have imagined. The sacred fire was not dying because of anything Aiisha had done wrong. It was dying because the spiritual world itself was changing. Ancient powers were shifting. Old alliances between the human and spirit realms were dissolving, and the sacred flame that had once burned with the passionate intensity of creation was slowly being extinguished by forces beyond mortal understanding. And Aiisha was the only person in the world who knew. She could not tell the tribal elders, because knowledge of the fire's weakening would shatter their faith and throw the entire nation into spiritual chaos. She could not tell the medicine men, because they would blame her for failing in her sacred duty. She could not even tell her own family, because the burden of such knowledge would destroy their peace of mind. So Aiisha kept her secret, pouring more and more of her own life force into the dying flame, watching herself grow gaunt and hollow-eyed as she sacrificed her own vitality to maintain the illusion that all was well. It was during this time of secret struggle that Yatzos arrived at her hogan. Yatzos was a young medicine man from a distant part of Navajo territory, handsome and charismatic, with eyes that seemed to hold depths of wisdom beyond his 28 years. He had come, he said, to deepen his understanding of the sacred fire and to receive spiritual guidance for his growing practice as a healer. "Honored firekeeper," he said as he approached her hogan with the proper rituals of respect, "I have traveled many days to seek your wisdom. The elders of my region speak of your connection to the sacred flame as the strongest in living memory." Aiisha felt a flutter of warmth in her heart that had nothing to do with the fire she tended. It had been so long since anyone had spoken to her with such genuine admiration, so long since she had felt appreciated for something other than her dutiful maintenance of ancient traditions. "You are welcome here, Yatzos of the Western Mesas," she replied formally. "But I am only a keeper, not a teacher. The fire itself is the source of all wisdom." "But surely," Yatso said with a smile that made Aiisha feel like a young woman again, The keeper of such a sacred trust must have insights that ordinary people cannot achieve. I would be honored to learn from your experience. And so began a relationship that would prove more dangerous than any enemy the Navajo had ever faced. Yatso stayed near Aisha's hogan for several weeks, supposedly to deepen his spiritual practice through proximity to the sacred fire. Each day, he would join her for the morning and evening rituals, and each night they would sit together speaking of spiritual matters under the vast star-filled sky. Gradually, Aisha found herself looking forward to these conversations more than anything else in her carefully regulated life. Yatso's was intelligent and thoughtful, with questions that challenged her understanding in ways that stimulated her mind. More importantly, he seemed to truly see her as a person rather than just a guardian of an ancient tradition. "Tell me, Aiisha," he said one evening as they watched the sacred fire dance in the stone circle that contained it, "do you ever feel lonely in this position, cut off from the normal joys of life?" The question struck her like an arrow finding its mark. For 27 years, she had buried any thoughts of personal happiness beneath the weight of her sacred duty. She had never married, never had children, never experienced the simple pleasures that other women took for granted. "Loneliness is a small price to pay for the honor of serving the sacred fire," she replied, but her voice lacked conviction. "Is it though?" Yatsos asked gently. "Would the spirits truly want you to sacrifice all personal happiness for duty? Perhaps there's a way to serve the sacred fire while still experiencing the full richness of life." These conversations continued night after night, with Yatso slowly and carefully undermining the foundations of belief that had sustained Aisha through decades of isolation and sacrifice. He never openly criticized the tradition she served, but he planted seeds of doubt about whether such extreme devotion was truly necessary. And as her emotional defenses weakened, Aisha found herself struggling more and more to hide the secret of the dying fire. The breaking point came on a night when a terrible sandstorm struck the mesa, winds howling like angry spirits around the firekeeper's hogan. Aisha worked desperately to protect the sacred flame from the driving sand and debris, her own spiritual energy flowing into the fire to keep it burning against the supernatural fury of the storm. But this time, her strength was not enough. For the first time in 3 centuries, the sacred fire flickered and nearly died. Yatsos was with her in the sacred chamber, helping to shield the flame with his own body. When he saw what happened, he watched as Aisha poured her very life force into the failing fire, her face growing pale and drawn as she sacrificed herself to maintain the flame that was meant to burn independently. "By all the spirits," Yatsos whispered, his eyes wide with shock, "the fire is not sustaining itself. You are feeding it with your own energy." Aisha tried to deny it, but the evidence was too clear. In that moment of crisis, her carefully maintained deception had crumbled. "How long?" Yatsos asked softly. 3 years, Aisha whispered, tears streaming down her face. 3 years of watching it slowly die. 3 years of keeping this terrible secret. Yatsos moved closer to her, his hand gentle on her shoulder. "You poor woman, you've been carrying this burden all alone. But why? Why not tell the elders? Surely they could help find a solution." "Because there is no solution," Aisha said brokenly. "The spiritual connection itself is weakening. The ancient contracts between our people and the spirit world are dissolving. If the elders knew, if the people knew, it would destroy their faith. They would lose hope. And without hope, the Navajo nation would crumble from within." "But you cannot continue like this," Yatsos protested. "You are killing yourself to maintain an illusion. At this rate, you will die, and then the fire will die anyway." Aisha nodded, her face etched with exhaustion and despair. "I know, but what choice do I have? At least while I live, the fire continues to burn. My death will come eventually, but until then, our people will have hope." Yatsos was quiet for a long moment, his mind clearly working through the implications of what he had learned. "There might be another way," he said finally, "a way to restore the sacred fire's connection to the spirit world." Aisha looked up at him with desperate hope. "What way?" "Ancient magic," Yatso said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Old rituals that predate even the sacred fire itself. Dangerous knowledge that has been hidden away because of its power to reshape reality itself." "You know of such rituals?" Aiisha asked breathlessly. I have spent years studying the old ways, Yatzos replied. Ways that the current medicine men consider too dangerous practice. But in desperate times, perhaps desperate measures are necessary. Hope blazed in Aisha's heart like the fire she tended. Tell me what must be done. Not here, Yatso said, glancing around the sacred chamber. Such knowledge cannot be spoken in the presence of the dying fire. Meet me tomorrow night at the old ruins on Storm Mesa. There I can show you what I have learned. Aisha agreed immediately, her judgment clouded by exhaustion, desperation, and her growing emotional attachment to the man who seemed to offer her salvation. The next night, she made the dangerous journey to Storm Mesa, leaving the sacred fire under protection of temporary rituals that would maintain it for a few hours. It was the first time in 27 years that she had left her post, and the guilt felt like a physical weight on her shoulders. Storm Mesa was a place of ancient power, covered with ruins from peoples who had lived in the region long before the current Navajo settlements. It was also a place that traditional Navajo avoided, considering it spiritually dangerous and unpredictable. Yatzos was waiting for her in a circle of standing stones that predated any known Navajo construction. Around the circle, he had arranged various ritual objects that Aisha didn't recognize. Stones carved with unfamiliar symbols, bundles of herbs that gave off strange scents, and small totems made from bones and feathers. What is all this? Aisha asked, sudden unease creeping into her voice. The tools of restoration, Yatzos replied, but something in his tone had changed. The warmth and gentleness that had drawn her to him were gone, replaced by a cold intensity that made her skin crawl. I don't understand these symbols, Aisha said, pointing to the carved stones. They're not Navajo. No, Yatzos agreed. They are much older, from the time before the current spiritual order was established, from the time when different powers ruled the world. A terrible realization began to dawn in Aisha's mind. Yatzos, what exactly are you planning to do? His smile was sharp as a knife blade. I am going to save the sacred fire, just as I promised, but not in the way you expected. The ritual circle erupted with dark energy as Yatzos began to chant in a language that predated human civilization. The carved stones began to glow with sickly green light, and the air filled with the sound of otherworldly screams. The sacred fire is dying because it represents the old order. Yatzos called out over the supernatural din, but death is just transformation. I will transform into something far more powerful, a gateway for the ancient powers that ruled before the spirits your people worship ever existed. Aisha tried to run, but found herself trapped within the ritual circle by invisible barriers. She watched in horror as dark energies began to flow toward the distant mesa where the sacred fire burned. You used me, she gasped, understanding flooding through her. You made me reveal the fire's weakness, so you could exploit it. You made it so easy. Yatzos laughed, his form beginning to shift and change as the ritual progressed. Lonely, desperate, carrying a burden too heavy for any one person to bear. All I had to do was offer you understanding and affection, and you gave me everything I needed. The transformation was nearly complete now. Yatzos was no longer fully human. His features twisted into something reptilian and ancient. Around the circle, the carved stones were cracking and bleeding shadows into the air. The sacred fire will become a beacon for my masters, the creature that had been Yatzos continued. Through it, they will enter this world and reclaim what was stolen from them eons ago. Your people will serve new gods now, Aiisha. You have helped to deliver them into slavery. But even as despair threatened to overwhelm her, Aiisha remembered something her grandmother had told her during her first days as firekeeper. The sacred fire is not just a flame, the old woman had said. It is a connection, and connections work both ways. If dark power tries to flow through it into our world, light can flow through it into theirs. With this thought blazing in her mind like a new sun, Aiisha closed her eyes and reached out with her spirit toward the distant sacred fire. For 27 years, she had poured her energy into that flame. For 3 years, she had sustained it with her very life force. The connection between them was stronger than blood, deeper than bone. And now she would use that connection in a way no firekeeper had ever attempted before. Instead of sending her energy to the sacred fire, Aisha drew power from it. All the spiritual energy she had poured into it over the years, all the accumulated blessings of centuries of faithful tending, all the pure spiritual force that connected it to the realm of light. She pulled it all back into herself in one desperate surge. The effect was instantaneous and devastating. Aisha's body blazed with sacred fire, her form becoming a living torch that burned with the accumulated holiness of 3 centuries. The dark ritual circle cracked and shattered under the onslaught of pure spiritual energy. The creature that had been Yatso shrieked as the sacred light tore through its false form, revealing the twisted shadow thing that had been hiding within the guise of medicine man. "Impossible!" it screamed. "The fire is dying. It has no power left." "The fire was never the source of the power," Aiisha said, her voice echoing with the authority of all the fire keepers who had come before her. "We were every keeper who ever gave their life to tend the sacred flame. Every generation that poured their faith into its light. You thought the fire was weakening, but it was only transforming." With a gesture that felt as natural as breathing, Aisha directed the sacred fire burning within her outward toward the shadow creature. The thing tried to flee, but there was nowhere to run from light that blazed with the power of an entire people's faith. The creature dissolved like mist before the dawn, its death screams echoing across the mesa before fading into silence. But Aisha's task was not finished. The dark ritual had already begun to affect the sacred fire back at her Hogan. Even now, she could sense tendrils of shadow trying to corrupt its light, attempting to transform it into the gateway the creature had planned. There was only one way to stop the corruption and ensure that the sacred fire would continue to burn for future generations. Aiisha had to sacrifice herself completely, pouring not just her energy but her very essence into the flame, transforming herself into the spiritual fuel that would sustain it for centuries to come. The choice was no choice at all. With a prayer to all the spirits who watched over the Navajo people, Aiisha opened her heart completely and let the sacred fire consume her from within. Her physical form dissolved in a burst of pure light that could be seen across the entire Navajo territory, her sacrifice burning away all traces of the dark corruption and restoring the sacred fire to its full spiritual power. When the medicine men and elders reached Storm Mesa the next morning, drawn by the supernatural light they had witnessed, they found only a circle of glass where the standing stones had been melted by the intensity of Aisha's sacrifice. But the fire keeper's Hogan, they discovered something miraculous. The sacred fire burned brighter than it had in living memory, its flame dancing with vitality and spiritual presence that took their breath away. And within the fire, clearly visible to all who looked, was the spirit of Aiisha herself, her form made of living flame, her eyes filled with love and wisdom that would watch over the Navajo people for all time. A new fire keeper was chosen, Aisha's young niece, who had always shown sensitivity to spiritual matters. But this keeper would not serve alone. Whenever the responsibilities grew too heavy or the burden too great, she would feel the presence of her aunt within the sacred fire, offering guidance and support. The secret of the fire's near death was never revealed to the people. Instead, they were told that Aiisha had ascended to become one with the sacred flame itself, achieving a spiritual transformation that guaranteed the fire would burn for countless generations to come. And it was true in its way. The sacred fire had not been dying at all, but transforming, preparing for the day when it would need to defend itself against ancient enemies. Aisha's sacrifice had completed that transformation, making the fire not just a source of spiritual power, but a guardian spirit in its own right. Years passed, and the story of Aisha's transformation became one of the most sacred legends of the Navajo people. Young fire keepers learned that their duty was not just to tend the flame, but to be willing to become one with it if necessary. And sometimes, when the wind was right and the night was dark, people would swear they could hear Aisha's voice carried on the flames, singing the ancient songs of her people, and reminding them that the greatest power came not from taking what belonged to others, but from giving everything in service of love. The sacred fire burned still, watched over by a living flame that was once a woman who loved her people more than her own life. And the Navajo nation remained strong, protected by a guardian who will never abandon her post, never fail her duty, and never let the light of hope be extinguished from the world. This is the way of the fire spirit. This is the way of the Navajo. And this is how one woman's trust betrayed and transformed, became an eternal shield against a darkness that seeks to devour all light.